It's spooky season, so let me tell you a horror story about an old school that's haunted. Two people entered an old school that's haunted by ghosts of former students. They didn't know this before they went inside, though. They only knew that it was abandoned and that it was rumored to be haunted. As soon as they opened the door, they heard chains dragging metal moans. Then they felt cold spots where the air itself seemed to be disturbed. As they walked down the hallway, the temperature dropped rapidly. The hair on their arms stood up and their skin began tingling as if they were being watched. They entered the first classroom and saw old desks and chairs stacked against the walls. There were books lying around with their pages torn and scattered across the floor. The musty smell filled their nostrils as they brushed past the decaying wood. Suddenly, a book flew off a desk and landed at their feet. Its pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations they didn't recognize. And then they heard whispering voices coming from inside the room. They turned around, but there was nothing there. Was it just the wind? They thought maybe it was best to leave. But as they turned to go, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin and seemed to be made out of darkness. The face they couldn't see. They screamed and ran down the hall, tripping over books and scraping their knees on the floor. They burst through the front doors and into the sunlight, collapsing onto the grass in a panic. When they looked back at the school, they could have sworn they saw the dark figure standing in the doorway watching them. But when they got closer, it was gone. They checked the windows and they were all boarded up from the inside. Shaking and crying, they called the police. As they told their story, the officers just smiled and shook their heads. They said it was probably just kids playing a prank. But deep down, they knew better, and so they thanked the officers for their help and left without another word. Back at home, they tried to forget about what had happened. They showered and changed their clothes. They locked all the doors and windows. But no matter what, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the dark figure standing in the doorway. They heard the chains dragging metal moans and the whispering voices. And then they smelled the musty odor of decaying wood. Finally, they decided enough was enough. They would go back to the school and face their fears. So they grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and headed out the door. As they walked toward the school, they tried to calm their nerves. They took deep breaths and reminded themselves that it was just an old abandoned building. There was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, they knew that wasn't true. When they arrived, the sky was dark and stormy. The wind howled and the rain poured down in sheets. Perfect for a ghost story. They stood on the porch and hesitated. Should they really do this? They didn't know what they would find inside, but they were determined to find out. So they took a deep breath and opened the door. Inside, everything was dark and silent. The storm outside had completely blocked out the little light that came in through the dusty windows. They couldn't see anything in the darkness, but they could feel something watching them. Their every move, every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of the wind sent shivers down their spines. Suddenly, they heard a noise in the classroom. They froze and listened intently. There it was again, a loud bang followed by heavy footsteps. They grabbed the baseball bat and crept toward the sound. As they approached the classroom, the footsteps grew louder and more frantic. Then they stopped abruptly. Taking a deep breath, they opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty. The footsteps were gone. They walked around the room, checking under the desks and in the closets. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. As they turned to leave, they noticed something strange. One of the books lying on the floor was open and the pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations. They didn't recognize the words or the symbols, but they could feel the power emanating from the book. They knew instinctively that it was dangerous, but curiosity got the better of them and they couldn't resist reading it. As they read the words aloud, the room began to shake and the air grew thick and heavy. They could feel the presence of something evil in the room with them, watching them, waiting for them to finish the incantation. When they reached the last word, the room exploded in a blinding flash of light. They shielded their eyes and stumbled backward. When they looked back, they saw a dark figure standing in the middle of the room. It was tall and thin and seemed to be made out of darkness. Its eyes glowed red in the gloom and its mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. They screamed and ran for the door, but the figure was faster. It moved with a speed that was unnatural and it was upon them in an instant. They could feel its icy fingers on their skin and hear its raspy voice in their ear. It whispered words of power and control and they could feel their strength draining away. They struggled against the figure, but it was no use. They were too weak, too scared. They collapsed to the ground and waited for the end. But it never came. When they looked up, they saw that the figure had vanished. The room was empty once again. They were alone. Shaking and sobbing, they crawled out of the classroom and into the darkness. They didn't know where they were going, but they didn't care. All they wanted was to get away from the school and the evil that lurked within its walls. As they stumbled through the darkness, they heard chains dragging metal moans. They quickened their pace and suddenly they were back in the hallway. In front of them was the door, the same door that had led them into the school. They had come full circle. They rushed through the door and into the night. They didn't stop running until they were far away from the school. When they finally looked back, they could see the dark figure standing on the porch watching them. It raised its arms and let out a blood-curdling scream. They turned and ran faster. They never looked back. They never went back to that school. But sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, they can still hear the chains dragging metal moans and the whispering voices. And sometimes when the storm is really bad, they can even hear the scream of the dark figure on the porch. If you want to know what happens to those who stay in the school too long, listen closely. It happened to a guy named Ben. He stayed in the school too long, and now he has one of the ghosts that haunts its halls. Every night he walks the halls with his trusty lantern, searching for anyone who might have wandered in and gotten lost. If he finds them, he'll try to lead them out of the school, warning them of the danger that lies within. But if they refuse to leave, he'll have no choice but to trap them inside. And so if you ever find yourself lost in the old school, don't stay too long. If you do, you might just become part of its history forever. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Bye.